Chef Patchai, good afternoon, everybody. This is our third micro method workshop with a content expert on MMIP, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and People and Task Force. This is a collaboration with War Cry Podcast. Our sponsor for today is Na'a Fund. The topic can be sensitive and triggering. Again, welcome to this episode of War Cry Podcast. We are an all-native run podcast discussing data, events, stories, issues, and historical connections about Northwest missing and murdered natives. We are located on the Yakima Reservation, and thank you for joining us for this episode. My name is Emily Washings, and co-host today is Robin Pibashi. Our guest today is Chris Cuestas from the National Violence Prevention Resource Center, and I'll turn it to Chris to introduce himself and the micro method workshop and the content we'll be covering today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be able to bring you part 3 of our micro method workshops. We're going to be covering some more specific data regarding task force developing and the final steps of actually putting your task force in place. Our next session is going to be more along the lines of how does a task force reach out and begin to incorporate everything that they've learned and have developed to address the issues of cold case investigations and MMIW issues within their tribal setting. This has been a really great experience, and I've had just a tremendous time working with the War Cry podcast team, and I'm looking forward to even some expansion in the future and to be able to bring you more timely, up-to-date, and topic-specific education as we begin to address these issues that are challenges within tribal settings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to step into screen share here, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. Micro method workshop number 3. What we're going to be addressing with this session is basically looking at strategic planning of the task force. We're going to be looking at operational procedures, developing and the use and the necessity of task force subcommittees, addressing the community needs by developing a community assessment. How do we capture information in the form of community-based surveys that support the community assessment to help create the strategic plan, and compiling supportive data. And probably everyone's favorite is sustainability. How do we pay the bills? We're going to try to condense all this and try to get it out within the time frame that we've been given. And I think it'll be probably one of our better sessions because we are really looking at meat and potatoes of task force development as opposed to just generalized information. Our task force is still under the construction phase, but we're just about completed to where we can put everything together and then begin to apply what we've learned and what we've developed to address some of our community needs and some of our challenges to be able to impact and offset some of these developing and evolving subcultures and trends within the tribal setting. So we've established the task force, developed all the supportive information, the protocols. We know that the task force must be overseen by a board. We showed you last time we met a flow chart as to how it's a top-down strategy. The task force must be directed by procedures. You have to have procedures in place so that everyone is aware of what their responsibility is. Everyone is comfortable with the membership of the task force, and also that we begin to develop this collaborative. It's essential to have procedures because you want to keep the task force on task. Not that they won't be on task, but here's the challenge, and this is one of the biggest issues when it comes to a task force. When you take on challenging and layered issues within a setting, tribal or otherwise, for example, MMIW, MIP, there's so many facets and factors and layers to addressing MMIW and MIP. It's it's very likely that the task force is going to just take off in varied directions. And you have to have more of a direct approach, becoming methodical and developing a process and learning your team is not going to happen in your first session. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some development. That's why your task force facilitator is really important to have, especially when it has had experience in actually putting the nuts and bolts together of a task force, as opposed to just being thrown a manual and saying, this is how task forces are supposed to operate. But having that field experience and that developmental experience of actually facilitating the task force, you had to learn all the nuances of what happens within a community setting, a tribal setting, when it comes to getting this collective and this collaborative moving in one direction. It's clear that reviewing and accepting your rules and procedures is a very valuable first step in having group cohesiveness. So when you have one of your first introductory sessions, you bring them all together and you step by step review what the procedures are. There was a question last time when we met, well, are you going to have disruptive individuals in a task force meeting that are more aggressive or agitated about the topics that you're going to cover? Yeah, you're always going to have people that are upset and are going to ask, why did this take so long? And why are we doing this now? But when you explain the rules and procedures and that there's time frames for us to speak and to verbalize our opinions and then minimize their ability to provide Q&A, then you really lessen the impact of those disruptive individuals. And if they want to stay part of the task force, that's fine. High energy, very aggressive regarding the subject matter. And those types of individuals you can actually put to work. But to review and cover and address and explain the rules and procedures is probably one of the most important steps to take at the beginning. And then once they review the rules and procedures, it's not a bad idea to have them sign off that they've read them and that they've reviewed them. Because if you do have an issue at a later time, you can bring it back to that document that was signed for their involvement in the task force and how the task force operates. I'll give you a quick example. This is a task force that I'm currently facilitating in Puyallup, and we have the explanation of what the procedures are. Again, remember, if you're interested in these documents, all you have to do is press the screenshot button, and it'll give you a copy on your desktop or on your laptop. But we explained the task force procedures, how many times it meets, that you actually have oversight in the form of a board, an oversight board, that who is the facilitator of the task force. And you kind of break down all the steps that we operate in the form of subcommittees, which we'll cover in a minute here. And then how you are able to bring issues to the table and get them identified and get them resolved. And then when each individual fills out a task force application, and then they actually sign off that they've reviewed the procedures and that they will maintain the confidentiality of the task force. Not that you're developing this big secretive underground movement, but it's just to have those protocols in place so that people understand, look, we have a facilitator, we have a board, we have the memberships, and we're going to be talking about pretty delicate information that we want to work at and address as a community-based entity. And we want to keep it in-house. And it kind of sets the tone for a operational and a working group, as opposed to just a group that has a meeting for the sake of having a meeting. And the more procedures that you put in place, the easier it is to develop that fluidity that you need to operate it as a community-based group. So that's why I think that procedures are very important. There's procedures for the board. We covered them last session, and there's actual procedures for the task force. And the board signs off on the acknowledgement, and the membership signs off an acknowledgement of the procedures and how the task force would function within that tribal setting. So let's talk about subcommittees. Why are subcommittees and what do subcommittees do within the framework of a community-based task force? Well, these are small subdivisions of the main task force that consider community measures that need to be reviewed and resolved. And then the subcommittee will then report to the full task force regarding their findings and the next step or the direction for that subcommittee to develop and pursue. The interesting thing about task force is they're very important because this allows the members of the group of the task force to break into smaller groups to accomplish individual tasks, which I think is really essential to a working group. Talented people with high energy normally will gravitate toward projects. And then they'll even tell you, I want to be part of this task force, but I actually want to work on something. I just don't want to sit here and be fed like a baby bird. I actually want to accomplish something, which I think is either a barrier or something that we need to resolve within our setting or something that we need to develop. And I say don't try to calm that energy down, because I think that's really important for a task force. And it allows you to accomplish things faster if you have someone that has that type of energy and determination and insight. And the task force actually will determine the deadlines of the project and the subcommittee response to the group. And the subcommittee chair will usually report back to the body of the task force in the form of an agenda item. So subcommittees are very important. They allow you to not only pursue or move forward on your task force objectives, but they also begin to assist you in breaking down some of the barriers and some of the challenges that exist when you're developing a working collaborative within a particular setting. A perfect example is, well, if you have a task force and members of that task force will want to participate in the day-to-day operations of their employment with the tribe. So a subcommittee can be formed to go and meet with the tribal leadership and give task force members the opportunity to attend the task force meeting during the workday and not be charged for missing work or not be questioned for what their, where their time is being spent, because it's a community-based initiative, and you're going to draw your task force membership from the community itself. So it would be best just to get them to come into that task force meeting under the auspices of a tribal employee and not be have any repercussions for doing that. So that's a very simplistic subcommittee that can be formed and get those questions answered about, are we going to allow to come or attend the task force meeting during the course of our workday? Pretty easy, but you're accomplishing some of the tasks that you need to be able to move forward as a collaborative. Limit your scope of your projects and your objectives until your task force has a fluid working process, meaning that you have your task force that you know who your workers are, who the ones that are going to be talented with specific roles within the group, people that can relate and connect with some of your other tribal programs. And then you have those individuals that are more supportive, that want to participate in activities and events. So there's a time frame to where you begin to learn who those individuals are and what roles they'll play. So until you have those developed and have some fluidity as to how the task force is going to move on, keep your objectives, I would say, for the first 6 to 8 months, relatively small. And this means that the group is beginning to accept its place and its role within the larger collaborative. And they begin to establish their contacts within the community, and they get known for their work regarding several topics within the tribal setting. Many task force members already have ongoing relationships, and either familial or professional. They also may have working knowledge with some of the programs that they may be tasked to participate and get certain issues resolved within that task force and within that tribal setting. So those people that have those contacts and connections and information, and they're willing to participate in the subcommittee, perfect place for them is to put them into a smaller working group. For example, if you're going to be, it may have gone. One of the things that a task force is going to have to be challenged with is reviewing the code. There's sometimes when you have disruptive activity within the community setting, you have to codify that behavior, write law and order code. So a subcommittee would be best suited to network with the tribal prosecutor and potentially one or two of the tribal judges to obtain their opinion, their insight, and their direction. They may even have seen some other code that they had thought about, and you can use those same individuals to review your drafts. You come up with a draft, you see if they like the way it's written or if it should be changed, or you should change some of the verbiage from shall, may, or will. But that's how a subcommittee operates. You work with the individuals that already have some contact and some knowledge of what the issues that you're going to be addressing. So that there's a benefit to that. And subcommittees have got to be in a position to recognize that. And a lot of times they will, especially because of their previous experience and knowledge of community and how the tribe operates. The community assessment. Basically, it's the tool that's developed to direct and confront the community-based and regional challenges. The assessment is kind of the overall review of what your issues are and what the challenges are and how the community got to the level of the challenges that they're dealing with currently. You have to be able to obtain and gather information to support for the leaders, tribal leadership, and for the members of the board and the task force and the community, why we are operating in this direction and taking this path. And the assessment is the perfect tool to do that, because the assessment basically brings all of the multi-facets of input into one particular document, which I think is really essential for a community that not only wants to address some issues, but also look at some strategic planning, because strategic planning is essential to be able to address some of these issues. The community assessments compiles information from varied sources that can be used to identify growth patterns and trend analysis. And one of the things that I think is very, very much ignored in tribal settings is using data, because data can help you map, and data can also help you develop a strategic response to what the community challenges are. And there's so many software programs out there where you can collate this data, and the data will begin to bring to the surface some of the bigger issues that the tribe needs to recognize. I recently saw a report based on calls for service of a community where crimes that were being reported, they were all surrounding the tribe's casino. And what the report was telling you, or what the data was telling us, was the criminal activity surrounding the tribe property was beginning to encroach on the location where most commonly individuals attend that have money in their pockets. And the crimes were connected to money-based issues like narcotics, selling of stolen property, fencing, things of that nature, purchasing of guns. And it was all of the data suggested that all these criminal elements were encroaching on the tribal casino. And you could see within the map of all the compiled data, you could see just this buffer between the casino and all of the criminal activity that was taking place. So to me, what that is telling me is that we need to bring more of a focus for insulation between the tribal's property and those criminal elements that were encroaching. And that's what data will tell you. Data will assist you in not only identifying what the challenges are, but it will also help you to recognize what some of the surveillance mechanisms you may be able to put into place that can influence those tendencies and those growth patterns that are taking place within the community setting. But I think there's a tendency to downplay data. And it's kind of interesting where we're talking about community-based policing in tribal communities that are now transitioning to community-based policing. But one of the biggest facets of community-based policing is the inclusion of data. It's interesting how they're figuring or addressing that dynamic. Is if you're doing community policing, you need to be inclusive of data. So why not begin to allow data to be a partner to not only to what you're addressing in the community, but also what your needs assessment are to not only the community itself, but to the tribal leadership with regards to resources and allocation and use of equipment. It just kind of seems like there's a disconnect. And I think the more you do that, the better off the community will be to address some of these really challenging issues that we see on the horizon with regards to tribal land. So that's just my sense with regards to data. And data can be included in the assessment because you're tabulating and collating and gathering perspectives on challenges within that setting. The community assessment is going to pinpoint those existing risk factors. It's going to specifically tell you this is where it's taking place, this is the how it's happening, and it will also bring to the attention of the community where the problem derived from. Was it something that came in? Was it a transplant behavior? Was it something that we saw developed internally? Is it something where we saw families move back from metropolitan communities and bring those influences to us? How exactly did this begin to seed within our setting and then begin to mushroom? That's what the assessment does. It also serves as baseline data. And that's a real challenge for tribal communities because we're finding that more and more grant opportunities and funding opportunities are telling and advising tribes, we're not going to rely on state data to support a tribal grant. And what they're trying to do is they're encouraging the tribes to begin collect their own information, their own tribal data and tribal statistics, so that they can include that into their request for funding in the form of grant. But baseline data also helps to support action plans. Again, it's kind of the way of 21st century application of resources. I think the tribe needs to recognize that and begin to look at how can data analysts come into our community and begin to assist us because it does really have an impact. The challenge is who's going to be tasked to accomplish this role for a community. And here's where one of the challenges take place. What we're looking at is we're looking at a significant challenge of MMIW, MIP in tribal settings. And the communities themselves are rising and putting pressure on the federal government to begin to address these issues because these challenges did not occur in a vacuum. Something has transitioned over the course of years to get us to where we're seeing this behavior being mushroomed. So what is the response? Well, the response can't be, well, here's a book. I'm going to give you a notebook on how to develop a task force. And then I'm going to walk away and I'll check on you 6, 8, 10, 12 months down the road and see where you are. I know of some tribes that are in that position right now because they were given a book 6 months ago or a framework, if you will, without any actual roadmap or how-tos. And a lot of their evolution and development has been stymied because they really don't have the background on facilitating a community-based action plan, an assessment, strategic development, and also facilitating the day-to-day operations of the task force. And here's the other challenge, is the majority of tribal professionals haven't invested, and they are overwhelmed with the same issue that non-tribal settings are, looking for workers, looking for individuals to come in and take on roles and responsibilities within the tribe. Hiring, behavioral health specialists and substance abuse specialists and treatment specialists, because what we're seeing is the pool is getting smaller and smaller. So what I'm finding, my experience is the tribes need more than just a recipe. They need more plans specific to developing the steps of the task force, kind of like what we're doing here. And I'm going into just generalized terminology and generalized development. We can spend additional sessions.
Hey, Chris, I just want to give our viewers just a chance to understand and take in what you're saying right now. I think it's really great to talk about this aspect of the micro workshops and how they connect to basically this federal act, Savannah's Act. This training is happening and taking place as a result of Savannah's Act from the Department of Justice. And what Chris is talking about is there's this booklet handed to tribes, and they're basically said, these are the different tools. Here's some presentations. Now go and create this. So it's essentially connecting why these micro workshops connect to that process that's being undertaken by tribes throughout the nation right now. But I wonder if you can also, in that talk, just frame 1 or 2 sentences, if you could, to tribal council at tribes or even community of tribes about why tribes should prioritize task force in their communities now.
That's a very good question. I will start off by explaining that they will not take the time to develop or resolve infrastructure issues with regard to MMIW, MIP for the individual tribes. Each tribe has to have its own protocols in place. Each tribe has to have its own responsive rules and procedures in place. Each tribe has to have its own deployment rules and procedures in place. And each tribe has to have its own family support elements in place with regards to the family feeling the repercussions of their missing or murdered or lost loved ones. That's not something that the federal government's going to go back and fix for each individual tribe. Can you just imagine that it would be virtually impossible for them to do that? So having a community-based collaborative where they can begin to develop their own protocols and their own procedures and work within that tribal setting, and even begin to look at some of because we've already seen that some of this behavior can be connected back to domestic violence issues and also relationship violence issues and also the tribal drug issue. So to begin to codify and also be responsive to those challenges that we know are contributors to the MMIP issue is another thing that the federal government is not going to individually take the time out for each tribe to develop. They're leaving that to the sovereign tribes to develop. So we need to look at surrounding our loved ones and our tribal ladies and two-spirit individuals with proper codes, so when they find themselves initially at risk, then they can begin to look for and contact law enforcement and look for services and resources internally instead of waiting until they end up becoming a victim. And I also think the tribes need to recognize that the federal government is not going to go back and individually resolve the victim witness issues for the families in those tribal settings. That's something the tribe's going to have to do. The tribe's going to have to write those protocols. It's going to have to write those procedures. It's going to have to look for the resources to provide services and assistance and for the victim's family, and provide those introductory steps for the family to take when they are missing a loved one. And who do we turn to? How do we get these things going? How do we navigate this criminal justice system? That's going to be up to each individual tribe. The federal government is not going to go back and fix that on behalf of that particular tribe. It's just too monumental of a task. So those are all things that the tribes need to address internally And the way to do that internally is through what we've been working on here, is developing a community-based task force that is recognized within the tribe, that is also sanctioned by the tribe, which is endorsed by continuing resolution. And you begin to take these challenges individually to tribal leadership and get them resolved. And then you begin to incrementally begin to build up responses for all of those challenges. And that's what these micro method workshops were intended to do, is to get us started and to give us more knowledge to develop these community-based task force in the tribal setting, opposed from just giving us a generalized note. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes.
All right, let's go on.
Yeah.
Community-based surveys. Why are surveys important? A lot of times we kind of downplay it because surveys in of themselves, we think they're time consuming. We think that they're, even if I fill this out, it's a waste of time. But I think if you develop surveys specifically as opposed to generally, you can really get some insight into what's happened to the tribe and what direction the tribe has taken. The community surveys will basically take the pulse of that community. It's going to capture their insight on what the issues are at the community level. It's one thing to get information and insight from the program level, but to get it from the citizenry is really essential. You'll obtain information that identifies what previously may have worked within the community, and what derailed that energy or that action or that program or that process. And I found every time I do an assessment of tribal communities that they did have a lot of solutions to the issues, but there was some internal changes, maybe some politics in play, and maybe just some dynamics that broke down, and the project lost its inertia and it just subsided. But conceptually, it was a great idea. Topic selection for these surveys will be based upon the greatest need within the community. So you're going to be brought in to address specific issues, for example, MMIW, MIP. So you begin to build your survey around those issues, and beginning with the actual experience of loss of loved ones. You can add those questions in the form of a survey. You can also include questions with regards to, do we have enough code to support community members when they sense that issues are taking place where they may end up becoming victims because of either relationship violence or dating violence or some of these other issues that we know that are direct contributors to the MMIW concept. So yeah, you build your surveys along that line. As a courtesy, if you're going to cross over, I've found this a lot with communities, is that other programs have already surveyed the community. So you can either use their survey information, or you can ask them permission to resurvey the community population. And the survey is going to give you both quantitative and anecdotal information. Remember, this is not the quantitative information is good, but anecdotal information is supportive, and you want that included as well. And you can also have just general information regarding your subject matter if you add a comment section. And I always add a comment section. I add 4 or 5 lines at the end of that subject matter that I'm surveying, so I can have a community member, an elder, a program person, give me either some anecdotal or some general knowledge, or just some insight on why they believe those challenges are within that setting. So, and then once you compile, and the way I do my surveys is I will have a general session, a general training session, and I bring just a cross section of the entire community in the one locale. And then I will tell them that they're attending the session, which is for their benefit, but the response is just to fill out the survey for me. And then I will also schedule a session, a session in the schools, because I want the youth population to be able to respond to the surveys as well. And they'll get the insight from the youth. And then if we have time, I try to do a program specific from all the tribal professionals to attend a training. And then I will get their survey information from them as well. So, and I think the last assessment I completed, I think we ended up with 383 surveys. And then you compile that data, and that data, here's a couple examples. Remember, if you're interested, just press the screenshot. You compile that data, and it really begins to give you some insight on what some of their sense of what's happening to their community, and their sense of where they think they lost out on, and that there are things that aren't being done any longer within the community. And then I always ask them, well, what do you think we could do to make it better for your community? What could we do? This is what negatively is impacting the community. And I allow you to categorize that from worst to least. But I also asked them in the survey, what do you think we could do to implement and bring back into the community to offset the influence at your level? And then you get all varied aspects of community insight. And it's really kind of unique, and it's valuable because I've never had a survey where the community has not exceeded my expectations, because the knowledge is there. They're aware of what the issues are at that level, community level. They sense it every day. They see it every day. They acknowledge it every day. And a lot of them are saying, well, why isn't this, and this done? Why don't we have an officer here? Why don't we have a camera here? Why, things of that nature that are common sense, really common sense responses. But for some reason within the evolution of that community, they've discontinued certain issues that used to be preventative in nature. So you write that into your assessment. This is what we assessed. This is what we measured. This is what the community gave us. This is what the solution of the communities are. So you're not going in there and this is really valuable to me. And this is, Emily brought this up, Department of Justice coming in and telling you with this notebook, what you're doing is you're having the community partner with you and giving you the direction that you're looking for to write a strategic response. And that's completely different than coming in and telling the community what to do. And that's why the survey is so important, because it's a partnership and it gives you that insight and direction that the community has. And you include that insight. And on top of the data, and we'll talk about the data is good. I have no problem with data, but the surveys I think are very powerful, because you have individuals that are giving you their level of information and interest on what the challenges are. And then you can compile it. Go ahead.
Real quick, I think we have a question about surveys.
Okay.
I was wondering, I had one question, but you kind of already answered it. It was one, if we could see some examples, and you had just showed that. One would be in community assessments, what are examples that you have seen of growth patterns and trends? And then actually I have a different question after that, which would be, would there be a benefit to have these assessment findings available to the whole community, like either on a website or somewhere given out to the community? And how could that be done?
I think there is a benefit to the community, but I don't think, because when I do an assessment, I not only put quantitative information, I put examples on my assessment. And I think sometimes the examples are taken out of context. So because the assessment oftentimes is used internally. So if you can put like the percentage results for what they feel some of the issues are and how they rate the community challenges from worst to least, I think it would be a great issue to put on there. Some of the other issues, kind of like this drug survey that shows what they see their family using in the form of illicit substance in their setting, I think also would be impacted. And especially if you can look at crime data, one of the things that we saw was a connection between the increase in methamphetamines and property crimes. Because that's telling you that, these drug users are very active in the community to try to find resources to purchase and use the drugs in that setting. So law enforcement data is real important because you'll see trends. I think some of the crime I saw for the assessment was kind of overwhelming, where I think they had like a 300% increase in sexual assault. This was pre-COVID. And I think they had like a 200% in community burglaries. You can tell when that is mushrooming behavior, and that mushrooming behavior in the form of criminal activity, it's going to cause a real outbreak within that particular setting. And it did. So that's why I think it's real important to connect the 2 points. And surveys can be released to the public as long as there's a sense of what will do more good than harm. Because I don't think specific examples are a good thing to do, because people will say, well, I know who that is, and I know where that picture came from and things of that nature. So, but just general data is good for a community to be aware of.
What is that term you used? Mushrooming?
Mushrooming is when the criminal behavior gets to a certain point, and then there's overwhelming, where it's like, for example, a 6 to 8% increase in criminal activity from year to year. It's not uncommon. But when you see like 325% increase in sexual assault, I mean, that's mushrooming. That's exploding of behavior. And that's telling you that something significant and drastic is going to transpire in that setting. But you can do that with crime data. And the good thing is that you can compare that to crime data, to tribal crime data, and then local crime data. If you find that there's only a 3% increase in sexual assault in your surrounding communities, but there's a 300% increase in sexual assault in tribal communities, that something's amiss. Something's not right with regards to either the reporting process or the investigative process, or it's being underreported or maybe overreported. It just depends on what the data is, what the stats are, and what the response is within that particular setting. Which brings us back to data, compiling that supportive data. Behavioral trends are best determined within a 3-year period. I always ask for a 3-year period. One of the caveats right now is that 2020 and 2021 are useless because of COVID. So it's going to be impossible to find any real trends with 2020 and 2021. This year is going to be, so you're going to have to go from 2019 and use 2022 to see whether there was really a transition of certain behaviors. And statistical information can be used to support an assessment and a strategic plan. If you say, I'll go back to what I mentioned before. If you say a 300% increase in sexual assault, you are looking at an emergency situation. And you had better get some advocates, you'd better get some law enforcement, maybe even develop a sexual assault task force, and maybe even begin to have community-based locations where victims can come in and have some safety and safe havens. That level of increase, that tells you that there's really something going on. You cannot just accept 327%, say, well, we investigate the cases as they come in. No, that's way too much. It needs specialized attention. Here's an example with regards to statistics. If there's an increase in property crimes that coincides with the access of illicit narcotics, it's safe to say that the property crimes increase, burglaries, thefts, larcenies, is connected to the availability of drugs and drug traffickers within that community. Because it's very common for the two to go hand in hand. Drug users and drug addicts, they will look to the easiest, straightest line to obtain resources that they can turn into money, to purchase the product to meet their need and to feed their addiction. So usually what happens in a community that has an increase in drug activity is you'll have an increase in property-related crimes, and those property-related crimes will then, you'll have a location or two where that property is going to be turned over into cash. It's usually 1 to 3 cents on the dollar in the form of fencing. Now, the most popular fencing locations are usually bars, because they don't ask questions if someone comes in, or asks somebody to come out in the back and look at a stereo or whatever they decide, or jewelry or whatever they're stealing. So if you see an increase in property crimes, it's because you're having a greater influence of drug trafficking within that setting. And right now, I think Percodans are all the way to $17 a pill. And there are some, there's a dual pill, I forgot what it's called, but it's an opioid. It's $100 a pill. And it's normally or frequently prescribed to tribal elders. And they're getting up to $100 a pill. Well, that's a lot of property that you have to steal to be able to purchase those street drugs. So 3 years of crime stats, 3 years of charges, criminal charges, and 3 years of individuals referred to treatment will actually assist in supporting the synopsis of an increase in drug usage or of a drug trend. You can also determine the amount of community members that will be impacted by those community risk factors. I'll give you an example on the next slide. Community enrollment numbers will provide the baseline information of your total amount of community youth. They categorize youth. It goes tribe by tribe. Some tribes youth is under 21. Other tribes youth are under 18. But you can determine the amount of youth currently in need of services of existing risk factors, and then apply those growth patterns within that region. And the result will identify the potential impact of your risk factors within the next generation or within the next 18 months to 2-year span. And that's what you want to offset the next wave of the influence within the youth population. Here's an example. Our current data right now is identifying that the vaping usage is increasing 30% per year amongst tribal youth. If you apply this trend to your current youth population, then you can safely determine the level and degree of vaping that you're going to have within your community. Now, the reason youth are turning to vaping is because access of liquid THC that is basically undetectable, and they can flavor it like strawberry or whatever flavors the vaping industry is using, but it's not detectable as THC unless you do a blood draw and do a blood test. So young people are aware of this trend. So now they're recognizing that the perfect vehicle for me to use THC, the elevated THC, not the THC and marijuana, because it's still relatively controllable through marijuana sales locations, but to concentrate that THC and use it through a vaping device when you're looking at purity of upper 90s, 92 to 97% pure. And that's not the marijuana that's being sold at the legitimate dispensaries. So the youth are looking at the vehicle of vaping to use liquefied THC that's undetectable. So unfortunately, that's. Go ahead.
Chris, can we frame this like as if we're talking to tribal grandmothers about what you just said a little bit? It's very technical, and I don't want to miss any points on that. It is important to have the technical aspects, but to a Native grandmother that might be raising grandchildren, you said there's differences in the THC that's present in vaping. What should they be what is the concern there? The
concern is the higher in purity of THC more impact the side effects young people will have. And the pure THC causes some pretty severe psychosis and mental health issues. And they're even saying, now they're saying dependency and an increase of young people using their control, being able to control their behavior. So they're less controllable and less, they're harder to supervise through the use of, because of the THC purity level. So as far as data goes, for example, if you have 300 tribal youth under 18, and we're growing 30% a year for 30% a year, so you're basically looking at a specific number of kids every generation that are going to with vaping, and subsequently you'll see more and more young people turning to some of these illicit vaping techniques in the form of THC. Your data will support that. So, and that's why it's important for guardians and parents and grandparents to be aware of not only the vaping challenge, but also that they have the capacity and capability to mix the vaping fluid. And one of our other challenges now is that we're having so much fentanyl that's being laced in marijuana, and also being laced in some of the vaping liquid. And they're still trying to find out how that's happening. But this is a recent trend within the past year where we're seeing more and more young people that are accessing fentanyl in marijuana and in liquid THC. So I hope that kind of clears it up a little bit more, but it is quite the challenge. Fentanyl is quite the challenge, and there's maybe we would have an opportunity to do something more with regards to street drugs for community members and adults, but that's what the data does. So the last thing, and probably the easiest thing for my opinion, is sustainability. I know people think it's the hardest thing to address when it comes to developing a task force, but it really isn't. It's actually one of the simplest things to do. A task force, a successful task force, is not going to face very many challenges when it comes to financial support, because you're actually addressing issues that the community leadership and also some of the other community programs are required to be able to address. Many communities have been looking for task force concept to address community issues for years. And once a task force shows a track record of being successful, it's easy to have funding opportunities and be continuous. There's a number of entities out there. Many task forces turn to state, federal, and local grants, which is fine if that's the way you want to fund the task force, or percentages from community-based grants. For example, if you have a drug court program, the drug court program does have funding allocated for community-based task force and also community assessments. So they already have that funding in place to support an assessment and a task force, not fully, but partially. Task force can also be funded from a variety of federal programs. I know the Safe Trails programs has task force funding, and Tribal Youth Program. Drug-Free Communities Grant is also a very good. The Drug-Free Communities Grant through SAMHSA actually has to be awarded to a community-based collaborative. The only problem with the Drug-Free Communities Grant is that your collaborative has got to be in existence for 8 months before you can apply. So it does behoove a tribal community to establish this task force. And the great thing about the Drug-Free Communities Grant is it's a 10-year grant, and it's specific to tribes introducing youth-related events and activities. The U.S. Attorney's Office also has funding for community-based initiatives and community block grants. A lot of community block grants are available through HUD, and you can access those through tribal housing. I think probably the smartest way to go about this is that one of the most effective mechanisms for task force funding is for the task force to identify itself and create a 501c3. Apply for private nonprofit status. And what this does is this, the task force can then begin to look for private foundation funding, which is totally different than grant funding. Because the good thing about the foundation monies is that they're non-competitive. They're non-competitive. The foundations just give out the money until they run out. Number two is you don't have to come up with this long, drawn out application like the grant process, the federal grant process has. All you have to do is have your 501c3 identified, what the objectives of your 501c3, and how the funding will support the foundation's initiatives. And then you submit the amount that can be, you can max out the amount that they want to award. And the good thing is that corporations backfill private foundation money all year long. It's a consistently funded source. So they're constantly awarding community-based initiatives. And you have every corporation in the United States that funds community-based collaboratives. But you have to have that 501c3. I mean, I've had task forces that have gotten money from Kellogg's, from Lowe's, from the George Lucas and his Star Wars labs. I mean, all kinds of federal, Apple, Microsoft. They set up foundation monies every year. And as long as it is within the framework of what they want to fund, then the task force would be very well received in the form of a 501c3 and then an overall awardee for a strategy. So to me, that's the direction to take it. And there's even a, one of the things that we even have tribal communities that want to develop community associations, a smaller community association, they can also apply for private nonprofit status. If it's a community, a coalition of tenants or of residents, and they develop their own 501c3, then they can apply for as a community coalition. And you can use that for street lights, cameras, bumps, speed bumps, signage. I mean, surveillance equipment, cameras. I mean, you can use that foundation money for any of those resources in the form of a community coalition. So that will pretty much end my third session, and I'll turn it over to Emily.
Thanks, Chris. I really took in a lot about this, and I think one of the key components is that this is giving a step-by-step process and outlining it, compared to, compiled information that is generalized and handed to you, which I do think gives some aspect of organization for tribes to at least frame what a task force is, the questions to ask. But really, when tribes are going through this training process from Department of Justice, it is leaving them a little bit like, well, what's the next step? How do we gather? We don't have a facilitator now. Our project facilitator in the federal government is on to the next tribe, on to the next topic. So I appreciate your comments, and I'll turn it over to Robin for hers.
Yes, I totally agree with that. Kind of letting tribal members know, community members and task force members, that the federal government is not going to do this for us, even if they could, or if they wanted to. This is something that we need to do for ourselves. But one of the big things I wanted to bring up is to thank you for acknowledging like energy in the groups, their strong emotions, because I think that's something that always kind of gets lost in the mix or is down sometimes. And you also acknowledge that it's okay if they feel this way. And sometimes having that energy in your group or task force can be a good driver in keeping momentum. And I really appreciated that. Because as a whole, I feel like advocates and families are definitely in the midst of these emotions. And before we started, I had showed you some pictures of my nephew's memorial and things like that. I'd shared pictures with you and just the experience. And that was 2 years in the planning. We talked about how that was started. He passed away in right before COVID started, and then that delayed everything. And with the experience of having some external force delay this grieving process and cut it short, or like I said, cut short or delayed it, has thrown a lot of families into the unknown. And the community's healing and grieving processes, and mainly the healing part, is also like in limbo. And it reminds me a lot of just what Emily says at the end of each episode, which is like, we're operating under the duress of colonialism. And I feel that as we're talking about these task groups, because they are advocates and community members for those who have lost people who are important to them. They're all in this like healing limbo, and they're also trying to operate under this duress of not only colonialism, and it feels completely imposed upon at times. But I love that you continuously say, like, this is why we need to continue to do it in this fashion. It seems like very analytical, and it seems like has to be done this way, but there are reasons for it. And for me, what that speaks to is that we'll be asked to do things above and beyond what has ever been done for us, as a community or as a tribal people, because we essentially have to be that, as you mentioned as well, the fluidity, that fluid portion in between what the community needs and how we can translate that into how can we get those needs met via, like you said, grants or government assistance or some kind of institutional impact, because those are essentially the entities that we're trying to influence to help us make that large impact, so that we can get out of this limbo of healing and grieving, so that we can have our families move forward. If that means like revisiting cold cases or having a better system, we've seen a little bit of that, having the alert system come about in Washington state at least, and I hope that starts a trend, for other states to also have their alert system. But again, in the end, I just am so completely thankful for you for doing these workshops. And let's see, I liked what you said earlier. I wrote it down. I said, tribes need more than just a recipe. And so I'm glad that we're also part of this actual showing how to do it, not just giving a book and saying, here you go. But again, just thank you, Chris. Thank you for being here.
I appreciate working with you guys. It's a lot of fun.
We also have another announcement I'm going to give before we do our outro. I thought Chris was going to have a longer response. No, but it's fun working with you too. Okay, for announcements, the Not Invisible Act Commission. Last week, Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland announced the Not Invisible Act Commission, which includes 2 Yakama Nation tribal members. The commission was established as a part of the Not Invisible Act, which Secretary Haaland sponsored during her time in Congress, and includes a cross-jurisdictional advisory committee composed of law enforcement, tribal leaders, federal partners, service providers, family members of missing and murdered individuals, and survivors. The 2 Yakama Nation tribal members are Patricia Whitefoot, who's also a co-host on War Cry podcast. Patricia is on the commission as a survivor or family member of missing and murdered person. And the other individual is Basilu Adams, officer with the Yakama Nation Police Department. As Robin said, we are an Indigenous-led podcast surviving under the duress of colonization and intergenerational trauma towards self-determination. If at any point during this session you need culturally appropriate advocacy or support, please contact Strong Hearts Native Helpline at 1-844-7-NATIVE or chat online at strongheartshelpline.org. I'm Emily Washings, and thank you to co-host Robin. Also, thank you to our guest, Chris Cuestas with National Violence Prevention Resource Center. This micro workshop series is brought to you by Na'ilahi Fund. This is edited and produced by Robin Peebushy of Peebushy Studio. Music by Lee Sikakwaptiwa. Logo and shirts by John Olney Schellenberger with Native Anthro. And remember to please like, subscribe, or leave a comment. It really helps us out.